The first thing we want to add to our game is a floor, which will provide us with a plane we can then position all of our elements on. This is extremely helpful since later on when we maybe have situations where we can see over the edges of our game, we'll see this floor instead of a blank black screen, which would look quite irritating. This floor will pretty much span through the entire scene to make sure that we always have a nice background. To edit, I'll create a new method in my game view controller class called setupFloor, and I will call it right after setup scene in my viewDidLoad method. Inside of my new method, I want to create an SEN floor instance, which I can then assign to an SEN node and add it to my scene. So let's create a constant called floor and set it to a SEN floor instance. I don't need to specify any parameters for the initializer here. The properties we want to change will be set explicitly now. We'll begin with floor.firstMaterial.diffuseContents and we'll set this property to UIColor.green, which will just paint our floor green. Since it's going to be grass later on in the game, this makes perfect sense for us. I will also set the reflectivity property on my floor to 0.0. This property defines how reflective our floor is, and since it should be grass, it would naturally not be that reflective. I can then create a node which will contain this floor, and I can then add it to my scene by defining a constant called floorNode and setting it to a new SEN node instance. I will initialize it with the geometry initializer, which I will pass floor to. This has initialized a node with my newly created floor, and I now need to add it to my scene by writing scene.rootNode.addChildNode, and then I add my floor node. Let's just see if this works, and therefore I will run my app on the iPhone X. The app started, but we don't see anything. To actually be able to see our floor node in the game, we'll also need to have a camera in our scene, which is directed at our floor node, so that we are able to see it. Let's just stop the app, and I will add my next custom method, which I will call setupCamera. Since I do want to access my camera in other methods in my game later on as well, I want to create a node for it as a property of the GameViewController class. So, right below scene and scene view, I will declare a variable called cameraNode, which I will initialize as an empty SEN node, so that we can use it in the setupCamera method as well as access it from other methods later on. In the setupCamera method, I will now initialize its camera property by writing cameraNode.camera and setting it to a SEN camera instance. I will then have to specify the position, as well as the direction of my camera node. Let's just think about how we should do this. Our floor is placed flat in our scene. Therefore, it would be ideal if we could place our camera above it and make it face the floor by looking down. To do so, I will set cameraNode.position to a SceneVector3 instance. We will have to use the SceneVector3 since for the position in SceneKit, we will have to define values for the X, Y, and Z coordinates in our three-dimensional scene. For X, I will say 0 to keep our camera in the middle of the X-axis. For the Y coordinate, I will say 10 to place our camera above the ground, and Z will be 0 again to keep the camera centered. Now I will have to make sure that our camera is facing downward, since by default it will look straight ahead along the Z axis. To change this, I will have to rotate it by -90 degrees along the X axis I can do this by setting camera node.EulerAngles to a scene vector 3 as well. In this case, the 3 values of the vector will specify the rotation in radians along the corresponding axis. Like I said, we want to rotate our camera along the x-axis, since this can make it face downward towards the ground or upwards. Rotating it around the y-axis will turn it to the left or right, and rotating it along the z-axis would tilt the camera. So for the x value, I said we want to rotate it by negative 90 degrees. I can't specify this in degrees though, so I have to convert it to radians. For 90 degrees, this is pretty simple, since 360 degrees would be 2 pi. 90 degrees will obviously be pi divided by 2. So let's write dot pi divided by 2, which will give me 90 degrees. I will just write a minus operator in front of it to rotate the camera downwards. For y and z, I will set 0 for now, so just to make our camera face the floor. Later on, in order to get this crossy road perspective that we are all familiar with, we tilt the camera a little differently, but for now, this angle should be sufficient. To actually be able to see our camera now, I will of course have to add the node to my scene. So just like adding our floor node. I'll write scene.rootNode.addChartNode and pass my camera node to add it to our scene. I will then also have to call my method, setUpCamera, from the viewDidLoad method right after calling setUpFloor. Let's run the app again. And if we did it correctly, we should now be able to see our green floor. And that's exactly the case. We're now looking through the lens of our camera down on our floor node, which we've added with a custom green SCN floor earlier. However, it doesn't really look like grass just yet. So maybe instead of just using a static color for our floor, a texture that we could apply to the SCN floor would be better.